In Broward County, we have Virtual Counselor, which gives us our students data for however many years they've been in Broward. But we also have, all the Somersets have the Target Model Data Disc, which is available at every school. And that will give you all your students' FCAT scores, BAT scores, and all the data that we have on them as well. You can always also go to your reading coach or your assistant principal if you're just looking for more information about your student, and of course your guidance counselors.
Very good. Once you have the data, how do you break it down? Could you start by saying, once I have the data?
Yes, that makes more sense. Okay. Once I have the data, I make sure to break it down by reporting categories in reading. I make sure that I look at the vocabulary, the informational text, the reading application, and see what it is my students have strengths in and what it is my students have weaknesses in. I tell my students these things so that they are aware, and we look at what we can do to improve in those areas.
Well, in elementary we have three choices. We can either go to our reading specialist, which in our case it's Ms. Hernandez. We can use Virtual Counselor, which is what I use often, and also we have a Target Model program that we use that also tells us our students that are performing at level, or that we call them cliffhangers, whether or not they're about to fall to the lower level, they're bubbled, and so it just helps us read the data a little easier.
At Classroom Data, we use Virtual Counselor. It has all the scores from high school and middle school, and we also use Target Data.
Once I have the data, I like to break it down by weakest areas, and so every student has a weakest area. It doesn't matter how high they score on the FCAT or on assessments in class. And so what I do is I normally form my small groups by using that data. I'll separate them into weakest areas, and then I target that.
We also use Target Data, a Target Data program that breaks it down by what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Once you give a formal or informal assessment, the most important thing is to tell your students how they did. They need to know, they need to get quick feedback so that they can react to it. They need to know if they're mastering the material or if they're not mastering the material, and then you can get into the why.
How frequently should these processes be done?
Your informal and formal assessment should be ongoing. Your students should constantly know what they're understanding and what they're not understanding. We do formal data chats in my class about once a quarter. So whenever we have new information, if we take a quarterly benchmark test, or if they've taken, in my case, the FCAT retakes and we get the scores, we talk about how they did, whether they've improved or not improved, and we always want to think about our ultimate goal and our next steps.
How do you tie in the data you obtain to classroom instruction?
In intensive reading especially, it is crucial that you understand what your students are doing, how they've done on the previous assessment, so that you can move on to the next one. Without that, you really have no basis to know what your students need to improve on or what you need to go back and reteach. It is really important that we are constantly checking. Did our students, if I was, for example, doing a strategy for paragraph shrinking, and I taught my students paragraph shrinking, did that help improve their comprehension or did it not? Is it because I didn't explain it well enough, they didn't understand the strategy, or is there something else that's impeding their comprehension? So you have to constantly sit with your students and constantly understand what are they doing, what is right, what's going wrong, and what do we need to do to change our instruction to make sure that they're getting to where they need to be.
How do you create classroom data?
I create classroom, hold on, sorry. It's just classroom data?
Yeah, this is how do you create classroom data?
Okay. Each of my students has a data chat form that we have at the beginning of the year, and I input some information because I have high school students. I input very little and I talk them through it and they input the rest. It's really important that, I think especially with high school students, you have next steps in mind. You have them thinking about what's after high school. Is college for them? What's after college? What are their career goals? They need to kind of think of way ahead. They need to be picturing way further ahead so that they can see what's the relevance to today. How does what I'm doing in my class today make a difference? How is it going to get me to where I want to go? I'm sorry, is that a problem with the beeping?
If you want to repeat that last part?
Yes.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
it's really important for them to think way ahead, because they have to think, how is what I'm doing today in class going to get me to where I want to be in the future?
After I give informal and formal assessments, I use it to constantly monitor my small group and change my small group as needed. So in other words, if I have a student, for example, that had that struggled with main idea, and I assess them and I see that they're getting the main idea, then I can maybe move them out of the main idea small group and put them into a small group of a different weakness and target that weakness as well. I also use the assessments to determine whether or not I have to reteach a concept to the entire class, because obviously if most of my class is not getting something, then there's something wrong with the way I taught it. So I use my assessments to gauge how students are progressing.
That's great. How frequently should these?
Informal assessments should be done maybe even daily if possible. It's something very, very simple like what I used, which is the exit slips. It allows me a quick assessment because I can take this home. It takes me, 10 minutes to grade, and I can separate them and sort them out by who got the concept and who didn't. And then on the very next day, I can either reteach or pool a small group based on whether or not they were able to fully understand the concept. I believe formal assessments should be maybe weekly or bi-weekly, or maybe at the end of a chapter or unit. The data that I obtain, I tie into classroom instruction, because obviously if my entire group is getting a concept, then there's no need for me to reteach it or spend a lot of time on it when I can be spending my time. It would be better spent by targeting weakest areas. And so I use the data that I collect by, it molds my instruction. It gives me an opportunity to reflect on what I've done and how they're getting what I'm doing, and then maybe having to reteach or pool small group. I use my assessments, and I also use accommodations that students have, and then student progress. So those three things I use in tandem to be able to create my classroom data.
What I do with my high school students is a little bit different than what I might do with other students, because I do want to put a little more on them for them to think about their own future. I create their data chat form in a fillable PDF, and I'll sit with the whole class and I'll talk about what we're going to do, and then I email it to them. They have to sit at home and they have to fill out what's missing, and they have to create their own goal statements. What is what we're doing in class and how is it relevant to their future? Then they have to sit with their parents and discuss it, think about what they're going to do in the future, and email it back to me. And that integrates technology. It also keeps them thinking about how to do things for the future.